Section 81 of American Myths and Legends, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. White House. The place in Virginia, not far from the national capital that is called White House, took the name because it was applied originally to the well-built home of a planter, now somewhat fallen from its ancient dignities. It is not white, and never was, but the fact that it is called so perpetuates the memory of a young man who aspired to be the nation's president. Thousands of American boys have the same ambition until they outgrow their youth, but they seldom believe so earnestly as did this one in their divine ordainment to election. The young fellow was a student, a Virginian, gallant, aristocratic in bearing, eager, intelligent, and deeply in love with the maid who owned the manor. Last of her line, she had received the old place as an inheritance, and lived here attended by 2 or 3 black servants of the family. The student's consuming purpose, aside from that of calling himself the husband of this young woman, was to be seated in the White House at Washington. He so often discussed this matter with the mistress of the manse that she, too, became imbued with the idea that he had been chosen by fate to shape the destinies of the Republic during at least 4 years of his life. It was possibly a wee pride in what she felt would therefore be her own station that caused her to accept him almost precipitately when he offered his heart and hand. They could not marry for a time, but the years of betrothal were, in part, occupied by rehearsals for their dignities to come. They went to Washington, where their relationship to old families caused them to be received into official society. They attended diplomatic dinners and presidential levees. They were often in the Senate galleries together, listening to debates. The young man knew little of politics, but he believed in statesmanship. On returning to her Virginia home, the girl gave a series of entertainments in honor of her fiancé and amusingly copied the forms and ceremonies peculiar to social observances at the Capitol. The neighbors noted this and began to speak of the pair laughingly as Mr. and Mrs. President. The servants, who took the matter more seriously, prayed on every Sunday that their hopes might be realized, and the older among them fell into the way of addressing the young man as Massa President. It was a pleasant dream. It may have had its uses in giving dignity and purpose to 2 young lives. In the South, a common exercise, even to the time of the Civil War, was the tournament. The Roundheads of the North frowned on such sports, but the Cavaliers of those states which bear the names of the Stuarts clung to the traditions of a remote ancestry, and although the joust no longer took the form of personal encounter and intended injury, it called for address and courage, and was to be undertaken only by skilled horsemen. A tourney was held at White House, and the student was one of the contestants. The riders were to charge a number of rings, and the one who returned with the greatest number on his lance would have the privilege of crowning his fair as queen of the feast. So, kissing his hand to the young woman whose colors fluttered on his arm and on whose white brow he never doubted he should place the wreath, the student spurred his horse, set his spear, and advanced at a gallop. He had almost reached the rings when a cry of horror went up from the assemblage. His horse had fallen, heavily. Friends ran to help him to his feet. The girl, who had risen from her seat, looked toward them anxiously. She saw one of them remove his hat. Her lover, then, was dead. His neck had been broken by the fall. When the young woman had recovered from the illness which seized her on this discovery, it was obvious that it was merely a physical recovery. Her face had gained no seam, her eye was bright, her step was light once more, but her hair was white and her face wore a curiously absent expression. From that day she lived wholly in the past, a past brightly colored by dreams the twain had dreamed of the future. Again her lover was by her side, student no longer, but first man of the land, and she, therefore, the first lady. Her home was the White House at last. The guests at the receptions and dinners were merely the neighbors, and sometimes it was the servants who sat in the places of honor, but all were received as grandly as if they had been dukes and duchesses, and beside her at every state banquet stood the chair of the president. So she lived and so she died, happy in the belief that she was mistress of the White House. End of section 81. Read by Debbie Talley, San Antonio, Texas, May 2nd, 2022.
Section 82 of American Myths and Legends, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. American Myths and Legends, Volume 1 by Charles M. Skinner. The Virginia Witch. Virginia did not pretend to be so good as New England did at the end of the 17th century, and very likely that is the reason why it was not so upset in its conduct and its intellects at the time when the Yankee witches were inviting death by souring milk and jabbing pins into the arms of hysterical girls. Grace Sherwood, the witch accredited to the Old Dominion, lived near Lynnhaven Bay in Princess Anne County, and her great sin was the crossing of the ocean in an eggshell. On this voyage she visited the shores of the Mediterranean, and finding there a quantity of rosemary, she dug up 2 or 3 healthy plants, loaded the eggshell with them, it must have been a rock that laid that egg, and set them out before her cottage, where they increased until the shrub became common along the sandy shores. The graver citizens of the county took alarm at this. If Grace Sherwood could cross the Atlantic in a shell, she could ride on a broomstick, and if she could ride on a broomstick, what could prevent her saddling and bridling a slumbering warden and riding on his back to a sabbat of imps among the pines? Plainly she was a dangerous woman. So, in 1706, she was arrested, examined by ancient and knowing women for unusual spots, and on complaint of Her Majesty the Queen, represented by Master Luke Hill, the public prosecutor, was condemned to the water test. In this, if a suspected woman drowned, it proved that she was innocent. If she swam or floated, she was guilty and was worthy to suffer death on the gallows or at the stake. This witch was bound by the wrists and cast into the sea, but the court, which was more lenient than some, directed that if she sank, she was not to be allowed to remain beneath the water until dead. However, she did not sink, but swam in spite of her tied hands, and this, together with the discovery of 2 moles on her body, proved her crime beyond doubt. The place where she was put into the water is still called Witch Duck. History forgets her after this test, but there is a tradition that she died in prison. End of section 82. Recording by Alan Mapstone.
Section 83 of American Myths and Legends, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Virginia Cocktail. While Mexico has its cocktail legend, and while we know that the Dutch in America used to prelude their meals with a Honstart of gin and bitters, Virginia enters the lists with a counterclaim for the national beverage and would feel hurt, indeed, if the award went to the Aztecs or the Knickerbockers. Her allegation takes this form. A comfortable tavern once stood and thrived near Culpeper Courthouse in the Old Dominion and exploited the sign of the cock and bottle, the cock lustily crowing the merits of the bottle. There was a certain play on words in this combination too, for in those days the name cock was commonly applied to the tap, and it fell about by an easy use that the unfortunate who got the last drink or tail of the liquor had the cocktail. A certain doughty colonel of Culpeper went to the hostelry one day to slake for an instant the burnings of a perennial and joyous thirst. Great was his disgust when he was served out of the muddy tailings of the cask. He flung the liquor on the floor and threw the bartender out of the place with the sarcastic remark that if an honored customer was to be served with such leavings, he would drink nothing but cocktails of his own mixing. In a frenzy that he supposed to be due to craving, but that his disciples alleged to have been genius or inspiration, he caught up a bottle containing gin and emptied half a glass of it, recklessly tossing in sugar, lemon peel, bitters, and a spoonful of vermouth, stirred a bit of ice with the mixture and quaffed it at a gulp. And behold, the sorrow was gone out of his heart, and he kept no hatred for the bartender any longer. He had invented a cocktail that would go down to posterity, and down posterity's throat, and life was once more filled with sunshine and alcohol. End of section 83, read by Debbie Talley, San Antonio, Texas, May 2nd, 2022.
Section 84 of American Myths and Legends, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by GWTN. American Myths and Legends, Volume 1, by Charles M. Skinner, Section 84. Among the early settlers of Kanawha Valley, West Virginia, there was a young physician, Dr. Triplett. At least he put out his shingle announcing himself as a doctor of medicine. But he took more pleasure and felt more pride in hurting than in healing, for he was a famous hunter, fisherman, boxer, and wrestler. And before he had been in Kanawha a month, he had beaten every man in camp, had become admired and important. Tiring of civilized ways and despairing of patience in such a healthy country, he moved up Elk River and at the debouch of the Buffalo built the first cabin ever erected in that region. He lived by the rifle, visiting the settlements but once a year to sell his peltry and buy supplies. Sometime after he left Kanawha, there appeared an Irish giant at the salt works, one McColgan. He was a fiercer fighter than Triplett. In a week or two, he had pounded every man in the village either into meekness or unconsciousness. But he was not liked as Triplett had been because he was surly, brutal, and revengeful, not satisfied with proving his supremacy in a battle, must break his opponent's bones or wound him in such a manner as to make him faint from loss of blood. Hence, there was a general wish to be rid of him, and the neighbors cunningly nagged him with reports of the prowess of Triplett. He heard so much of that redoubtable hunter that he finally decided to try conclusions with him, though it was a 3 days' journey to the lodge. The public sighed with relief when they saw his burly form disappear toward the wilderness. Dr. Triplett was rather startled by the invasion of his privacy when, 3 days afterward, McColgan asked the shelter of his cabin and told him that he had come all the way from Kanawha to thrash him. One or the other of the pair, he said, must be drubbed in order to have it understood which of them was champion of that region. In spite of the purpose of his visit, Triplett received him graciously and refused to fight until McColgan should have fed and rested after his long tramp. Realizing that sleep and supper would give him a probable advantage, the bully accepted this proposition willingly enough and warmed with the behavior of his host, to say nothing of his fire and long pint of corn whiskey. He thawed out quite decently, and the evening was passed in smoke and stories. After the newcomer was fairly pickled in liquor, Triplett asked him if he had ever chased a bear until he backed against a tree, then seized him by the hind legs and beat his brains out against the trunk. It was rare sport, he assured him. McColgan looked at his host with a new respect. A man who could handle bears like that was not to be easily destroyed. He would practice on a bear before he annihilated Triplett. Next day, he went into the wood and, as luck had it, scared up a bear and ran him against a tree. He seized the brute by the ankles, preparatory to swinging him through the air, when rip, biff, smash, the bear had cut open his face, delivered a hammer blow on his head, and flung him into a gully 10 feet away. As soon as he was able to hobble back, he told Triplett he had been hurt in a fall. He was afraid to undertake the flaying of the young doctor now, yet ashamed to go back to Kanawha. Triplett's surgery soon restored him, but he lingered in his cabin. The longer he stayed, the less he cared to fight, and after a month or so, he declared a friendship for the man he had hoped to trounce and decided to stay near him. He built a shanty where the town of Clay now stands. There he lived to a reasonable age, growing milder in his disposition and caring to fight but little. More than a generation after their settlement in the wood, the two, then 70 years old, sat on a log together, rehearsing some of their hunting experiences. McColgan looked sharply at Triplet and asked, "Do you suppose as a man ever got a bear by the legs and bait his brains out against a tree?" Triplet, who had years ago forgotten the question he had put to the Irishman on his arrival, answered, "I don't suppose any man is fool enough to try." "Then, begorra, we settle the championship of Elk River and the Great West right now," exclaimed McColgan, pulling off his coat and falling upon his companion. The acquaintances who stopped them declared the fight a draw, and from then till their death their friendship remained unbroken, each enjoying the honor of being the champion of the Elk River country. End of section 84.
Section 85 of American Myths and Legends, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Greg Giordano. American Myths and Legends, Volume 1, by Charles M. Skinner. Cape Fear River Outlaws. Among the Scotch-Irish immigrants who had come to this country in hope of peace and liberty, and had settled at Cape Fear River, North Carolina, were several who kept their allegiance to the king and sided against their neighbors when war broke out. Those who fought in the British ranks won the respect due to enemies, but there were a few desperadoes among them who ravaged the country in malice. Such were the three who had stolen Harriet Eskridge, a mere child, from the arms of her mother. Her people were too poor to offer ransom, but no expectancy of reward was needed to urge her friends to undertake the rescue. 3 stout farmers were quickly on the trail, and although they had to avoid the appearance of men hunters crooking about in the brush that the kidnappers might not be warned, stopping to eat but once a day, and traveling so late that they could barely make out the hoof prints left on the earth by the horses of the Tories, they reached, only an hour or two after the others, a hut near the head of Haw River. It seems to have been the purpose of the outlaws to leave the girl there, to meet death from starvation. Tying their horses at a distance, the farmers crept to the hovel on hands and knees. Then, at a signal, they dashed through the door and laid about them with clubbed muskets. Though the Tories caught up and fired their own rifles, they were so jarred by the surprise that they aimed no better than Spaniards, and were soon at the mercy of the Americans. No mercy was shown. All 3 of the raiders were hanged with grapevines. Harriet was released from her bonds. She had been tied to a post in a corner of the hut by leathern thongs, and was returned in safety to her mother. This act created a bitter feeling on the part of the Tories, while the boldness and uselessness of the abduction filled the Americans with disgust and wrath. Other outrages were to follow. Captain John Wood, an old Indian fighter who had served in the colonial army under Greene, Marion, and Sumter, was one of those soldiers who prided themselves on the fact that a reward had been offered for their heads by the British officers. The Tories undertook to earn it. They captured him when he was alone, unarmed, and lashed him to death with whips and rods, to atone for the lives of the Royalists he had hanged and shot. Just before his death he groaned, "I have a boy who will one day repay these cruelties." And they were repaid sooner than he might have hoped. With his mother's consent, Frank Wood, a lad of 18, joined the colonial army and took his baptism of fire, not many months later, at King's Mountain. Colonel Ferguson, who led a British column in that battle, had been accused of unsoldierly conduct when he carried the war into the Carolinas. He and his men were charged with plundering houses, assaulting women, destroying property, killing peaceable citizens, and rewarding Tories who had committed such acts of savagery as the killing of Captain Wood. The invaders had created no end of scandal in the land by bringing women to their camps, some from the old country, and some wenches of native families who had been attracted by the glitter and color of the British uniforms. General Cornwallis was accompanied by Agnes of Glasgow, whose tomb, thus inscribed, may be seen near the old battlefield of King's Mountain. His chaplain, one Fraser, not quite daring to appear among his soldiers with a mistress, took a Virginia girl to wife, forgetting that he had a wife or two elsewhere, and after selling her property and pocketing the proceeds, escaped through the American lines, reached Nova Scotia, and sailed back to his own country. Colonel Ferguson had 2 women in his camp on the day of his last fight. One of them, a certain Polly, ran away with a redcoat early in the engagement, but the other, known as Virginia Sal, was struck by a stray bullet and was buried with him on the field, wrapped in a bull's hide in lieu of coffin. Ferguson was wounded 7 times in that battle, but the ball that finally brought him to earth, never to rise again, was fired by Frank Wood, son of the man so cruelly put to death. Wood also shot 3 of the Tories, who had taken part in the killing of his father, and 10 others of the band were hanged, what was long afterward called the Tory Tulip Tree, on Broad River. A feud had now been opened that was not to be settled without the taking of many lives. Foremost among the Tory ruffians was Big Bill Harp, a Scotchman who had been captured at King's Mountain, but had escaped, and immediately began a tour of devastation. He burned the houses and barns of the Americans, killed or stole their cattle and horses, put innocent people to death, even slaughtered children in sheer devilry. A band of half-breeds and renegades went with him, and although at the beginning there may have been some notion of helping the royal arms, in the end Harp and his cutthroats kept the road as highwaymen and abandoned civilization altogether. One of his raids was on the Wood estate that had already suffered so heavily, and on this expedition it suffered more than ever in a material sense, while, worse than all, Frank Wood's sister was stolen and was forced to become the mistress of this fiend. As soon as he learned of this crowning outrage, Frank obtained leave of absence from the army, and, gathering his neighbors, took an oath with them to put Harp and his band to death. The scoundrels were slippery, albeit they left their trail in blood and embers. It was learned that for a day or 2 Miss Wood had been hidden in the Mammoth Cave. At last the outlaws were overtaken where the road from the Hopkinsville, Kentucky, forks to Morganfield, and a battle ensued. A few of the robbers escaped, the others were shot like rabid dogs. One of Harp's last acts had been to kill the wife of a planter. The planter chopped Harp's head from his shoulders and placed it in the notch of a limb on Lonesome Oak, where the fight had occurred, and so the long feud ended. End of section 85. Read by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida.
Section 86 of American Myths and Legends, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by J. Thurgood. American Myths and Legends, Volume 1, by Charles M. Skinner. Cain's Mark. A Virginian named Mortimer, who had suffered reverses in his own state, sold his property, all but a couple of slaves, and with his wife, 2 sons, and the 2 servants, removed to Murphy, North Carolina, where he lived for a few years in mean retirement, and died poor. Soured by this change from affluence to penury, the widow fancied that she owed some manner of grudge against humanity, for she had been brought up to believe that labor was beneath the dignity of white people, and she taught hardness of spirit and conduct to her boys, encouraged them in sharp practice in dealings with neighbors, supplied them with arms, and praised them for the taking up of quarrels, tolerated harshness and suspicion in them, urged them to gain whenever they could, and if need be to defend every personal right by violence. Such teachings bore their fruit. The elder of the sons had lent a few dollars to the younger, and after the time agreed upon for payment had gone by, he demanded the money, swearing that if it were not in hand within a few hours he would have his debtor's blood. Toward evening, the mother heard the young men in high talk at the gate, and went out to learn what was the matter. Almost as she came between them, there was a report. The woman gave a cry, for the ball fired by the elder son had cut off her forefinger as she was raising her hand. Then the bullet, entering the forehead of the younger, killed him instantly. The dead man had raised a knife against his brother, so that the verdict of the coroner's jury was self-defense. The mother was the only witness. On the night of the acquittal, Mortimer was visited in his chamber by his victim, who plucked out a few of his glossy auburn hairs and disappeared. The man lay as in a trance, unable to move or speak. On the next night, the visit was repeated, and every night thereafter for years. Each night the corpse had wasted a little, until at last it had become a skeleton, and it was unspeakably horrifying to the slayer to feel the bony fingers plucking at his hair, his beard, his eyebrows, his lashes, the hair on his hands. In time, he had lost every hair on his body, and had become a marked man. Though dreading the comment and curiosity of the people, he traveled from place to place, and went abroad, mostly at night, well muffled. Those who knew him said that he bore the mark of Cain. End of section 86.
Section 87 of American Myths and Legends, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Chuck Williamson. American Myths and Legends, Volume 1, by Charles M. Skinner. Section 87, How Bill Stout Settled a Mortgage. 13 miles from Russellville, Kentucky, lived the widow King. On a tract of 300 acres her husband had left her. He also left a mortgage, and although the amount unpaid was less than $400, the widow's creditor was troublesome. Unversed in business affairs, and hoping for a good crop that would enable her to clear away all indebtedness, she had recourse to a notorious skinflint of Logan County, who protested an interest in her and her orphans, and provided her with the sum she wished, at 60% a year compound interest. The crop that year was but ordinary, so the widow sold a slave and a horse. Next year it was ordinary too, so she parted with her other slaves and gave up furniture, dishes, glass, and farming tools, retaining only material enough for housekeeping. But even this did not suffice, and the usurer posted a foreclosure notice on her gate. Of course the rascal had the law on his side, but there were parts of the land in the first half-century of our history where the public opinion that made law was higher than the law it made. Such was the faith of Major Bill Stout, who, having served for several terms as sheriff, had resolved himself into a committee for the administration of justice, if not of law, and who inspired a wholesome respect for himself and for right conduct in the breasts of the unruly. Several robberies, outrages, and murders were punished by him, for he was an excellent shot, and his right thus to act as judge, jury, and executioner appears never to have been called into question by his fellow citizens, who indeed were grateful to him for the saving of expense and bother. The usurer, who had possessed himself of most of the Widow King's effects, and who was now in a fine way to get her farm, was walking through his corn patch on a sunny afternoon, wondering if a benign providence would so shape events that he would one day hold a mortgage on every house in Russellville, and be able to raise his interest charges to 75%, when he came to an abrupt stop, for he found a cocked rifle at his breast, and at the other end of this weapon stood Bill Stout, looking particularly grim. In a great trembling, the rascal cried, "What is the matter, Major? Why do you point that gun at me? What have I done?" "Oh, nothing to me, Harris. But old Master," here the Major glanced reverently aloft, "has sent me to kill you and throw you into that hole. He says you are not fit to live among men." "Oh, Major Stout, have mercy. Be good. Have mercy." "Don't pray to me. I have nothing to do with it. Pray to old Master. He may help you. I can't." "Oh, Lord, save my life. Oh, Lord, be good to my wife and children." "Ah, that's good. Now, while you're at it, put in a word for the widow and orphans you have ruined." "Oh, yes, yes. Have mercy on me, and on Mrs. King, and the King brats, and me, and—" "Hold on now. Pray for each one of the King family by name." "Yes, I'll do anything for them. And for you, if you'll only spare me." "Oh, you've decided on that, eh? Very well. I may. Mind, I don't promise, but I may let you off if you give back her niggers and release the mortgage." "Oh, my money! My money! To think of being robbed of my hard-earned money like this! Oh!" The Major raised the gun. Hold on. I'll do it." Stout had come prepared. The needful papers, together with a quill and a vial of ink, were in his pocket. He placed these on a smooth log, and Harris recorded his promise in steadfast black and white, though the tears started and his heartstrings tugged when he wrote the introduction, "Of my own free will and consent, I hereby," and so forth. Major Stout resumed, "Now, I'll let you go, perhaps, on 2 conditions. One is that you meet me at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning at the clerk's office in Russellville and acknowledge the release. If you fail in that, I'll chase you down, if it's from Lake Superior to the Gulf of Mexico, and kill you on sight. The other is that you shall not mention my part in this affair to anybody. You have no witnesses for that matter, and if this meeting were known, the widow might refuse to take back her property. Understand?" "I understand." The Major watched Mr. Harris as he went homeward, clutching at his hair and beating his breast. Then he looked at his rifle, whistled down the barrel of it, and departed. Next morning, the Widow King came into her own again. Major Stout looked large and happy, and Mr. Harris, albeit aged and worn, experienced a new sensation, for the clergyman spoke to him pleasantly, and the townsfolk lifted their hats and shook his hand. End of section 87.
Section 88 of American Myths and Legends, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. American Myths and Legends, Volume 1, by Charles M. Skinner. Some Georgian Lycanthropy. Lonely, unprogressive, oblivious of the progress made elsewhere in the world, the mountaineers of the Alleghenies live a life apart, a prey to countless superstitious fears. Theirs is a land where one slips back into the 17th century, where great hills and yawning gulfs seem to have cut them off from the advance of learning, as from those creature comforts so common in the humblest coast and prairie towns, where the man who is hysterically religious on Sunday and during camp meeting distills moonshine whiskey for a livelihood and shoots revenue officers who threaten to disturb him, where black and white magic flourish, and one may buy the service of the devil by scouring a tin plate in some remote cave or glen and avowing, "I will be as clear of Jesus Christ as this plate is of dirt." Here the future is still forecast by ceremonies, hearts are won by charms, and the coming of death is foretold by the howling of a dog, the aspect of the bark of 3 trees, a wild bird flying into the doomed house, a door opening by itself and knocks on the window. The white dog that haunts Trout Run, the black dog that scares the belated farmer in Chautauqua Valley, the white stag of Sequatchie, the headless bull that speeds over Big Frog Mountain, the bleeding horse to be met in the passes of the Great Smoky Mountains, the gray wolf that appears on Piney Ridge at midnight, the goblin of Haunted Hollow in Rockingham County that is at first one animal and becomes another while you look at it, the bear of Crack Whip Furnace that screams in a human voice, the invisible monster in the same neighborhood that beats horses but is frightened away by the name of God and cannot chase a victim across running water, the Ignis Fatuus, here called Jack Pallant, that one is compelled to follow when it beckons, the phantom brute that haunted a cruel slave owner to confession of murder and death, the buried miser who walked in the company of 2 women who had killed him for his money till they shrank to skeletons through the misery of his company and died in agony, the headless herald of misfortune who rides about Indian Fort in the Cumberlands, corpses that lie in rooms of deserted houses, and when the coroner goes to remove them, have disappeared without disturbing the dust on the floor. Witches who ride horses to exhaustion at night, unless the steeds are anointed with asafoetida and lard. And people who become beasts of prey at certain hours make the mountains mysterious and terrible. Haunts, likewise, are haunts, pervade the woods, watch beside tombs, and pester decent people in their homes. One woman, who had exacted from her husband an oath that he would always remain a widower after her death, was so distressed by his second marriage and the breaking of his word that his house became almost untenable. She floated about in the murk, sobbed, sighed, and as she passed the faithless one or any of his relatives on the stairs, the atmosphere in which she had enveloped herself was so chill it froze them almost to the heart. Of all the evil beings that trouble the hills, none are more dreaded than the lycanthropes, the witches who take the forms of animals. One of these creatures, who had been seen in his proper human form to walk on water and to rise in air, sat on the chest of a physician's sister-in-law, night after night, not in the shape of a nightmare, but of a wildcat, and so pressed her to death. Kinchifuni's swamp, in Georgia, where the Negroes fish for bream in the daytime, willingly enough, but who cannot be persuaded to go about there after sunset because of the spooks, was for a long time the home of the swan. This bird was an evil spirit in disguise, and it carried trouble and illness to every settlement in which it was seen. Many attempts were made to shoot it, but all were unavailing, until a clear-eyed, steady-handed army officer sent a bullet through its heart, and by general consensus the illness and trouble ceased on that day. One of the most remarkable accounts of lycanthropy comes from Fannin County, Georgia, where the Great Smoky Mountains end. A miller who lived in a long, low room just off from the place where he ground his wheat died suddenly of a disease no physician could determine. Before his death he attempted, but in vain, to tell something to his friends that they believed had a bearing on the cause of his illness, but his gestures were feeble and his words rambling. A second miller took the place, and in time a third, and both died in the same fashion. The mill was avoided for a while with fear. At last, a neighbor who lived down the stream offered to run the mill if he could have it on easy terms, and the owner allowed him to take it. He took an axe with him, cut some wood, and started a great blaze in the fireplace. As he applied the match, a brindle cat slipped out of the chimney and walked tamely about the room, sometimes rubbing against his legs. Seated before the fire, he brought out his Bible and read it with diligence, yet he could not repress a sense of something wrong, of something impending. The cat began to scratch and cry after a little, looking askant at him and his book, and begging to be let out. He read on. Presently he glanced down and saw the animal crouched before him with a baleful light in her eyes he had seen before, and not in the head of a cat. A shock of fright and repulsion went through him. He grasped his axe, made a blow at the creature, and cut off a forefoot. With a woman's scream, the cat leaped up the chimney and disappeared. Shaken and anxious, the man hurried home. His wife, in her human shape once more, had lost a hand. She bled to death. End of section 88.
Section 89 of American Myths and Legends, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The White Bride of St. Simon's. There was a day when King's Retreat was a famous center of hospitality. Thomas Butler King built it on St. Simon's Island off the Georgia coast and took most pleasure there when others found pleasure in his company. This island, where John Wesley preached his first American sermon and Aaron Burr was once in hiding, was often visited by the rice planters, whose slaves rowed them across from the mainland, and the retreat shone with light and was gay with laughter and music until the small hours. Among its guests, along in the 40s, was a lawyer from Liberty County with his young and lovely wife. They had been invited to King's Retreat to spend their honeymoon. Unluckily, another guest was there, a planter who a few years before had sued for the hand of the bride and had been rejected. Sense in breeding would have dictated a return to his own plantation, but he lacked both, and found a bitter pleasure in watching the endearments of the pair and thinking that but for this rival, the highest earthly happiness might have been his own. He drank more freely after dinner than he should have done, and in a harsh and forgetful moment he made a slighting and resentful allusion to the bride. With the hot blood of the South boiling in his veins, the husband struck him in the face. There was in that day but one way to restore peace after such a quarrel, and that was for one or the other party to slay his opponent. Back of King's Retreat is Lover's Lane, an avenue of live oaks 1.5 miles long, beautiful yet funereal in its drapery of moss. The avenue has grown darker, the vista more solemn with every year, for an end has come to the gaieties on St. Simon's, and the comfortable old mansion has lapsed deeper into decay from the autumn of its desertion. After dark, Lover's Lane never has a visitor, and the Negro laborers are more afraid of it than if pestilence walked there visibly. For on the night of the insult, the husband and the planter met under the live oaks with only a faint moon to light them. They were in the swing of the fight, steel beating against steel, quick rushes and stamping feet, breath labored, and free arms tossing, when a cry, near at hand, startled both of the duelists, and as by spoken consent they faced suddenly toward the point from which it had come, the lawyer, holding his rapier, advanced slightly as he peered into the shadow. Instantly came the flash of a white dress, a voice spoke his name, and 2 arms would have circled his neck, but the bride had run upon her husband's sword and had innocently accomplished her own destruction. Her happiness ended in his embrace. The duel was resumed, now with a deadly fury, and the insulter was presently stretched lifeless upon the sod. From that hour, a darkness deeper than the night overspread the existence of the husband, and still one will see the flash of that white dress, if he watches late, and hear the echo of a cry. That is why the Negroes avoid Lover's Lane. That is why King's Retreat is falling into ruin. The white bride walks there. End of section 89. Read by Debbie Talley, San Antonio, Texas, May 2nd, 2022.
Section 90 of American Myths and Legends, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Greg Giordano. American Myths and Legends, Volume 1, by Charles M. Skinner. The Drinking of Sweet Water. Loguchi, the puck of Indian sprites that flitted about the swamps and woods of Georgia, was not with the wood divinities when they met on the flower island of Okinofe to discuss the strange race that had landed on the shores. For though Loguchi was a merry elf, whose tricks and whims amused the other spirits, he so loved the Southland woods and waters that he would not listen to any talk of leaving them. He hid in a hollow tree and gave himself to bitter thought. Satilla, three-eyed messenger of the gods, sought for hours through his playgrounds, but did not find him. Like the moths and beetles that imitate the leaves and bark they rest against, he was not easy to see when he chose to remain quiet. For his face was brown and wrinkled, his cheeks were puckered like pine knots, his back was as rough as a pine cone. His little red eyes snapped and twinkled when they were open, but when shut, you did not see the wrinkles where they had disappeared. His nose was flat, his mouth was wide, he was short, bow-legged, and his knobbed hands ended in claws like a panther's. Yet, with all his ugliness of look, he was gentle, and the hunters hated him only because he turned aside their spears and arrows when they went to slay the deer. The sprites resolved to leave their home in the woods and follow the Creek Nation to the west, where other tribes were assembling. But Loguchi stayed. Sometimes at nightfall he could be seen scampering among the pines and savannas, startling red laggards, and even more, the white pioneers who were setting up strange lodges on the Sweet Water. The village they called St. Mary's. Trees began to fall under the white man's axe. Loguchi crept to their houses in the night, and bent and gnawed their tools, till he saw that with a magic of their own they made them straight again. Then that which so often happens among men befell Loguchi. From fear and hate he grew to tolerance. He could not leave his country vexed and blighted as it was, and he even found a new pleasure in frightening these pale-faces till they grew yet paler. He would drop into their paths, almost under their feet, as they returned from the hunt, and startle them with a squeal or a hiss. He would bound upon their shoulders from an overhanging bough, and before they had caught breath again, he was lost in the undergrowth, and they heard his shrill, defiant laugh. Going into the distance, he would make threatening faces at them from the copse as they went to their day's work, and at night he would prowl along the edges of their town and sound the call of fierce animals. But they were not such a bad people, after all, these men with the sick faces. They fought less than the red men. They never scalped and tortured. Once in 7 days they were sober. Sometimes it seemed as if they were trying to be good. The wood sprite shuddered when he heard the crash and groaning of the trees under the saws and axes, but he spread his nostrils and enjoyed the flavor when the cutters smoked in their camps at evening, for they smoked more furiously than the Indians, and tobacco was Liguchi's special incense. A girl at the settlement, wandering by the sweet water, came upon the imp, who was goggling fearfully, gasping, grunting, and hugging his foot. The poor creature was suffering, and although it cost an effort to overcome her repugnance, she went to his help. He had alighted on a thorn as he leaped from a tree. She withdrew the thorn and bound healing leaves upon the wound, a service that he acknowledged in the most frightening grins and gibbering. Indeed, he went through such antics in his joy that the maid was like to faint from dread. Yet he had a voice that was almost music. It was a voice she had often heard in the pines, and had never understood till now. He said, "The daughter of the white people is good. She shall never come to harm in the forest. The green people of the wood will watch her when she rambles by the water. If she sleeps, they will shadow her face and sing drowsy songs in the branches. They will drive away the snake as it comes near, and they will whisper comfort if she has sorrow. This and more, if the white maid suffers from forgetfulness, she shall bring her lover back, through the spell I put upon this water." The fright of the girl had passed, and a blush appeared. Her eyes fell under the gaze of the elf. He chuckled, as in delight at his own shrewdness, for he had guessed her secret. She loved an adventurous fellow of St. Mary's, who that very day told her he had resolved to be a sailor, that he might see the wonders of the deep and strange countries, and wrest treasure from the enemies of his king. She could not consent to this, even if the treasure were that of the king himself. Beyond all fame and riches she held himself. Liguchi plucked red berries from a bush that overhung the water, and cast them into the middle of the stream, muttering strange words and waving his arms. The stream boiled, and a little whirlpool appeared, and the berries were drawn down, and the surface was still again. "Make him drink of this," whispered the sprite, and with a bound he disappeared in the wood. That night, while the moon was rising, and balmy odors breathed from the forest, the lovers walked beside the branch of the sweet water. It was to be their last walk together. Tears brimmed from the girl's eyes, and the young man was silent and thoughtful. When they had reached the place where they had been used to rest during their rambles, the girl dipped a gourd into the stream and gave it to her lover. He emptied it at a draught, refilled it, and gave it to her. She too drank from it, and he did not go to sea, and the girl was a happy bride soon after. Liguchi disappeared, but his spell still lives, and they who drink of the charmed flood will never leave the country of the sweet water. End of Section 90. Read by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida.
Section 91 of American Myths and Legends, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Nancy Hart. In Hart County, Georgia, preserves the name and fame of a heroine who may truly be said to have flourished during the Revolution. Nancy Hart was not one of those willowy sylphs with hair of sunbeams, violet eyes, and a voice of music that are heroines of popular fiction. On the contrary, she was nearly 6 feet high, red-faced, red-haired, cross-eyed, big-fisted, stern of speech and countenance. She walked with a man's stride, and woe betide the unhappy wight who disagreed with her. 2 virtues made her admired in all the countryside: her cooking and her patriotism. Whether or not they knew as much about her loyalty as they did of her skill, it was unfortunate for a certain party of Tories that they presumed on both of these qualities, for in one of their forays they came to Nancy's cabin when it was time to eat, and rather forcibly suggested that she might prepare a dinner for them. She allowed that she might, and did. It was a good one also, good beyond expectation. They resigned themselves wholly to the joy of it, and stacked their loaded guns in a corner, without further thought of using them. These unbidden guests were eating and roistering, passing a bottle too, that they carried for just such occasions, when their hostess, pretending an errand in the corner where the arms had been placed, caught up one of the muskets and cried, "You are prisoners. I will kill the first that stirs." Not believing the sincerity of this threat, one of the company sprang up and ran toward her, extending his hands as if to seize his gun. He fell dead on the instant with a charge of buckshot in his heart. And before his companions could rise, Nancy had a second weapon in her grasp and was prepared to deal death to any other rash one. Her little son had meanwhile scampered to the quarters of a colonial troop not too far away, and to the captain of that command, Mrs. Hart was pleased to deliver 6 burly allies of King George, who had been a sore vexation to her neighborhood. End of section 91. Read by Debbie Talley, San Antonio, Texas, April 21st, 2022.
Section 92 of American Myths and Legends, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. American Myths and Legends, Volume 1 by Charles M. Skinner. The Cells of Fort Marion. Everyone who goes to St. Augustine, Florida, visits Fort Marion, the Spanish castle that is stoutest built, and so best preserved of the relics of the place. And viewing its dismal vaults by torchlight, the tourist half believes the tale of strangers rescued at the last gasp and overcome by the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Several of these vaults were prisons without a doubt. Structurally, they have no part in the defensive plan, hence they could not be casemates, and it is rumored that 1 or 2 had openings like those of the Morro of Havana, whence objects could be shunted into the moat, that the ebbing tide might carry them to sea. In one of these abysms, which had been walled up but was discovered by a prying soldier after the lapse of at least a century, were found 2 crumbling skeletons in chains, and across the space of time comes the whisper of their meaning. For one, when it walked the earth, had been the Doña Dolores, and the other a young captain of artillery. If you would know the resting place of the third and dominant figure in the tragedy, you must seek through the churches of Spain for a handsome tomb sculptured with the arms of a proud family, and bearing a list of titles and honors on the tablet. That is where the commandant of St. Augustine lies buried. His wife and rival became ashes here in the forgotten dungeon of Fort Marion. It is the old story. Rightly or wrongly, the commandant believed the Doña Dolores faithless, and to the Spaniard, infidelity in woman is the gravest of offenses. After long espionage, the elder officer had fixed on Captain Manuel as her guilty companion. Not a shade of difference in his bearing toward either of the suspects marked his distrust or his resolve, except that possibly he was more affable toward his subordinate, and his deference to his wife was more obvious in company. She could have had no fear of his discovery when she went to his office, obedient to his summons. Never was her dark beauty more affecting, her nobility and grace more consummate. For a moment, after they had been left alone together, the general regarded her with frank admiration. He even made a step toward her, and she smiled graciously, as if she had expected to be taken into his arms. But he checked himself, and, gazing fixedly into her eyes, spoke in a tone and in words that drove all color from her cheeks and caused her eyes to start like those of a hunted animal. "I know your story, and will spare your telling it. Since your heart is no longer mine, I will not claim your obedience. You shall be with your lover tonight, and henceforth." Almost fainting to her knees, the woman would still have spoken, but her husband, by a stern gesture, imposed silence. "Do not add falsehood in words to faithlessness in deed," he commanded. "As in shame you have lived, in shame you shall die." There was no escape. The guard was set. The gates of the fort were closed. "You have chosen between us," the veteran continued. Abide then by your choice, and say your prayers, for by this time tomorrow you will be in heaven, or hell, beyond need of them. Go to your chamber. You will soon be called." Hardly had she gained the privacy of her room and flung herself upon her bed in an agony of remorse and terror when Captain Manuel entered the general's office to turn over his charge as officer of the day. The general made no answer to his report, and under his keen and steady gaze the young officer grew confused. After a time the elder said, "You have never made a confidant of me in your love affairs, Captain." "What love affairs?" stammered the young man. "I know your secret," declared the commandant. "I insist that you make your meaning clear," demanded the captain. "I shall do so presently, but we will not discuss it. Enough that you are a thief of honor, a betrayer, and a scoundrel. I reduce you to the ranks. Your sword, sir." Captain Manuel started with rage and astonishment. He trembled in his eagerness to harm. "You lie!" he shouted. "And as for my sword, I will plant it in your heart before I will surrender it to any foe, especially to one of my own country." Darting forward, he aimed a blow with his fist at the face of the general. "Draw and fight!" he commanded, "or I will kill you unarmed." But Sergeant Calixto was close at hand. He was a sturdy fellow, and he had the young officer at a disadvantage because he attacked him from the back. He caught the captain's descending arm. The captain tried to draw his sword. The sergeant wrenched his wrist, and his arm fell, crippled at his side. "This is well," exclaimed the commandant, in a tense, low tone, with teeth gleaming through his grizzled mustache and beard. "You add mutiny to dishonor. The way is now clear to punishment. In me you see the authority of Spain. You attack that authority. You shall die, not as a soldier, but as a traitor. Not even the satisfaction of friendly tears shall be given to you. None but one will know your tomb. The time and way of your death may be guessed by those who open your tomb hereafter." In the small hours that night, two figures, bound and muffled, helpless in the grasp of Calixto and his men, are taken across the court from the officers' quarters to an arched entrance of the casemates. If they pause before the chaplain's cell, it is only for a moment. A solid door opens into the chamber without air or light, a door immovable from the inside. The two figures disappear into the gloom. Then is heard the sound of hammers closing rivets. The armorer withdraws, and the cell is empty, save for these two and the commandant, the latter looking at them by the light of a pine knot in his hand. He waits till the cadenced step of the departing squad has echoed to silence down the corridors, then steps forward and removes the muffles from their heads and the gags from their mouths. "God's curse upon you!" cries the captain. The commandant does not change color nor change his attitude. As he looks on them for the last time, a dark smile wrinkles his cheeks. "Good night to both, and pleasant sleep," is his parting. The door clangs, a key grates in the lock, and there is silence. End of section 92. Read by Brianna Childs, April 18th, 2022.
Section 93 of American Myths and Legends, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Chuck Williamson. American Myths and Legends, Volume 1, by Charles M. Skinner. The Caloosahatchee She-Man. Along the Caloosahatchee in Florida, they tell of a queer fellow known as the She-Man. It is believed that the death of his wife had unbalanced him, for shortly after the event he appeared in her clothing. The hunters and settlers had never seen such a freak and were disposed to make fun of him. but a look generally quieted them, the she-man's eyes being black and lowering, while his hands were broad and sinewy. At first he may have worn a woman's dress for no better reason than that he was far from settlements where coats and trousers were sold, Myers Village being 50 miles down the river. But he grew accustomed to his garb, old and tattered though it was, held to his thin frame by a dried snakeskin, and he wore it until his last day. His housekeeping was not a feminine nicety. His home was a cabin of slabs, his bed a heap of raw cotton, his chair a cypress knee, his dishes were gourds, his fire burned on a flat stone, and he lived on fish and corn. In a pool, not far away, lived his pet alligator, Devil, who obeyed his master like a dog, and relied on him to supply food when times were hard in the swamp. Devil and he had been friends for many years. The man had raised the gator from infancy. Some time before this poor daft creature had settled in his clearing beside the Caloosahatchee, he had quarreled with a man of pride and property, one Morgan, who claimed descent from the pirate of that name, but after withdrawing to the wilderness, he supposed he had seen the last of this neighbor. This was not to be, for some years later, while hunting in the wood, he came face to face with Morgan. The old pirate blood had warmed within him on a chance to gain some wealth he had not earned, and after his robbery he had fled to a part of the state where he was not known, for he did not care to trust his money in banks or industries, and had brought it with him in a chest. The she-man knew nothing of all this, and forgetting his quarrel, greeted his old enemy cheerily and asked him to supper at his house. Visitors were few in those parts, and he was eager for company. Morgan was affable. He chatted with the settler, his wife, and his boy, Jimmy, and asked the latter to go fire hunting with him that night, promising to pay him well. The lad consented. Not returning at the expected hour, his mother took her knife and pistol, for defense against wild animals, and went out in the starlight to look him up, while the father took another path. He discovered no fresh trail, so he resolved to bring his wife back, lest she should penetrate too deeply into the wood and be unable to find her way out. At dawn, he literally stumbled upon her, lying as one dead on the forest floor. She breathed, but that was all. By an exhausting effort, he carried her back to their home. Home? No, their house was a smoldering ruin. A little before the woman died, for the sight she saw that night was a fatal stroke, she recovered her power of speech. She had seen her boy helping Morgan to carry a chest from a boat on the river to the bank. A pit had been dug for it. As Jimmy stooped to press it more securely into place, Morgan had passed behind him, drew a dagger, and stabbed the boy in the back. Jimmy sank into the hole, limp and dead. Did the villain wish to kill his only witness, or did he hold the superstition of his pirate ancestor, that stolen treasure was safest under guard of the dead? The woman fell to the earth in a catalepsy, while Morgan filled the grave, concealed it with brush, and not knowing that his crime had been seen, hurried away to apply the torch to the house, for if the lad's parents lived, they might make vexing searches and inquiries. After the death of his wife and son, the settler, who from that time forth began to be known as the She-Man, built a cabin near the ashes of his former home and bided his time. Though he did not know exactly where it had been hidden, he felt sure that if Morgan lived, he would one day return for his money. And he was right. Years went by, but they brought the murderer at last. He arrived in secret, and following the river shores for a time, guided by certain marks, he came to the foot of a stout pine, where, after looking cautiously about him, he began to dig. Presently he threw out a human bone. It fell at the feet of a figure that made him start with astonishment and dread, a lank, brown, bearded man in a torn gown belted with snakeskin, glaring at him from the shadow of a sunbonnet. "In God's name, what are you?" gasped Morgan. "Don't call on God. Call on the devil, for he will take you. I'm Jim Baines." Morgan dropped his spade, his face turned ashen, and he fell to his knees. With a hoarse yell, the She-Man leaped upon him. He was like a beast for a thirst for blood, lifting and dragging the murderer, who seemed to be paralyzed with terror. He reached the pool where his sinister-looking pet was lying. "Here, devil," he called. And as the great alligator opened his jaws, Morgan was hurled into the water. His revenge accomplished, Baines died shortly after, and the treasure is anybody's for the taking. End of section 93. Section 94 of American Myths and Legends, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Chuck Williamson. American Myths and Legends, Volume 1. By Charles M. Skinner. The Blood Rose. They say you can find the real blood rose or Grant rose only in the western part of Jefferson County, Florida, and that all attempts at transplanting or raising it from slips of the original stock have failed. It is a strong plant with light glossy green leaves, but it flourishes only within 5 miles of the scene of the tragedy that named it. The flowers have incurving petals of the color of arterial blood. The odor they give off is sickly and unpleasant, and old residents of the county insist that the dews which drip from them has a cast of pink. John and Nellie Grant built a house near the Ocella River in 1834, and in the next year a child was born to them. The Seminoles of that region had become uneasy, but the settlers felt no alarm, for they were sure the government would persuade the Indians to peace, either by fresh promises, made to break, or by a great slaughter, before they could take the war path. Fatal coincidence. John Grant left his home on a September evening to ride to town, which was a long way off, with the promise to return next day. He could not keep that promise. For 6 miles from his home he fell into an ambush of the Seminoles and was shot. His scalp was torn off and his body flung into the river. Then the red men marched silently to the house. The hunting dog, lying outside, sniffed and whined. The anxious mother roused and listened. There was a loud yell and a rush of many feet. The woman raised a loose, wide board in the floor, and with her baby in her arms, dropped through into the cellar and escaped into the woods, which were soon lighted by the glare of her burning cabin. The Seminoles were quick to find her means and way of flight, and ere long she and her infant had shared the fate of John Grant. A few years later, the blood rose appeared on the spot that the mother and the baby had dyed with their blood. End of section 94. Section 95 of American Myths and Legends, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Chuck Williamson. American Myths and Legends, Volume 1, by Charles M. Skinner. St. Mary's Paradise. St. Mary's River, which partly separates Georgia from Florida, rises in a great swamp, which in a rainy season becomes almost a lake. The creeks maintain the existence there of a large space of high and fertile ground, which was an earthly paradise. It was peopled by a race superior to their own, whose men were strong and bold, and the women the fairest in the world. This land is defended against the approach of the unfit by labyrinthine streams and inlets, expanses of quaking bog, malarial mists, and entangling woods. Creek hunters who had been lured far from their homes in the chase of game reported that they had seen the island, but on every attempt to gain its shores, it seemed to move farther and farther across the swamp, while the paths and openings they followed invariably led them back to their tracks. Here were birds of sweet song and brilliant plumage. Great flowers opened their riches of color and perfume to butterflies that rivaled them in gorgeousness. The rocks, like the Laxus de Musica of the Orinoco, gave out music. Game was plenty in the wood. Fruits were to be had by the picking, and clear cold fountains flowed with health, giving assurance of life to all that drank from them. This may have been the land to which the good were admitted after death, a land where they were so happy that lamentations for them were wrong. Some of the southern Indians would weep at the first sight of a European, believing him to be one of their friends returned from the land of souls. Unless his visit were a short one, it would seem as though it were the exile had the better cause for tears. End of section 95. End of American Myths and Legends, Volume 1, by Charles M. Skinner.